think we're good to go. Thank you so much for coming along. I know it's one of these rare summer evenings where there's actually an opportunity to be outside. So I really appreciate you coming along. And I'm hoping this will be of use with some information. And there'll be a wee opportunity, as I said, at the end to talk through some of these things or even add your experiences with certain ways of finding information out and what works for you. So I'm going to kind of whiz through what research and resources are out there and what they kind of can be categorized as. A couple of techniques that I like to use to keep all of these things organized, which can be tricky when you're reading a lot for a topic perhaps, and a little bit about access and getting a hold of some of these things as well. So first up, we've got types of research. So there is a difference in how research is classed, and typically it's known as white versus grey literature. And this can be kind of important in understanding why something is published in the first place, the authenticity of what has been published, and the reliance of that information. So first off, we've got white literature. And that basically comes under the umbrella of anything that's published and peer-reviewed, and it's usually the first place to check when researching a topic. So this is when you're researching things, I guess, for projects like baseline studies, if you're looking at information that might be already published in a particular area or location, looking at these different research types can be really useful to give you an idea of what's been done before. So we've got the white literature, and these are typically produced by bodies whose main activity is publishing. So for example, that would be an academic publisher that produces a journal, for example. And then we have grey literature, which is kind of pretty much everything else. So that will include a research report, stats documents, policy documents, conference proceedings, theses, policy documents, and a whole host of other things. I'm just going to quickly pause just for a sec to let a few more folk in. I think someone's waiting in the sidelines. Maybe not. Okay, maybe not. It's okay. We'll continue. So we've got our grey literature, but there's also tiers within grey literature. And the most reliable of those tiers is the first tier, and that is anything that's a thesis, a government paper, a magazine, or a report. You also get second tier grey literature, which is an annual report, for example, from a group, maybe a news article. Some websites can fall into the second tier category. And then third tier can include blogs, presentations, videos, emails, and social media. So there's a different kind of categorization for these types of information, and it's worth just considering where that information you're reading sits in those kind of grand scheme of things. What's also interesting is that grey literature can actually provide a lot more of a local view on certain topics. So it's actually really useful in terms of if you're really in quite a localized area, which falls for most of our community marine groups who are working within particular areas. So that can be really useful. Grey literature can also be a little bit more tricky to find sometimes, chasing down something that you think has been, reported and finding out exactly where that was written. And it can often be more current, but the downside to grey literature is that the quality can vary. For example, something that's in a blog might not necessarily be as useful as something that could be in a magazine or a report that's been published. So that's our types of research. We're going to jump now into looking more depth into these different types of research. So our white literature categories are our journals and our scientific papers. The ones I put on the screen are some of the really, really handy ones to have a note of, because these are often the ones that have really local and kind of UK kind of themed studies that might be relevant to all the sorts of different monitoring work that communities might be doing. All of these are great, and will come a little bit more along the lines of access later down the presentation, but they do often publish open source material, which means you should be able to get it free of charge. So finding these articles, I am a big fan of Google Scholar. It is a very user-friendly way to find journal articles. And journal articles can be really difficult to find and to access, so this is quite a useful tool. What it allows you to do is look up particular terms and topics. So I've just had a wee screenshot of my search there that you can see is Marlbed UK. So really, really kind of wide, and trying to find out, what is out there in terms of marlbeds in the UK. So handily, you can organise all that literature by date. So if you're really interested in finding out what's most recent, obviously you can click on the most recent years, or you can customise your range if you know that you're looking for something within a particular time frame. There's also this really great feature which allows you to check out more of the published works of a particular author. And if that author is underlined, as you can see highlighted there, you can click on that author and you can go and look at all the other kind of literature that they've actually published, which is brilliant. And it allows you, especially if that particular author is really specialised in their field, you can find out other things that they've written. And obviously some researchers have more than others, but it doesn't necessarily mean they don't have that work available. So you can also do some quite fancy magical things with your search terms in Google Scholar. And these are called the really boring or kind of strange title of Boolean search operators, which sounds boring, but they are quite useful. And it allows you to kind of finesse what you're searching and make sure that you're finding stuff that's more relevant to the topic that you're interested in. So you can do basically, what I've got as a couple of examples here is if you put Merle and survey in the search term, you can find both of those, and it narrows your results to only producing works which include those two phrases. Merle or survey would allow you to find any studies that had Merle or survey, but maybe not necessarily both. So you potentially come across quite a lot of studies that just had survey, and that would be quite a lot of different studies basically, and that would put all the results, far more results than you probably want to look through. But it can be useful when looking for more specialised kind of phrases. Merle's survey in little quotation marks can be your search term when it's actually used as a phrase. So if you're interested in finding out anything that's been published that literally says Merle survey, that would be the one to use. And then underneath we've got the last two, so you can find things that include just Merle but without survey by putting a little minus mark next to survey. And then below, if you connect that up, those two words, it means that the two words are strongly connected and that you're more likely to find any research that really connects those two terms. So the big question and the big kind of annoyance in some ways is that a lot of studies and articles in scientific journals are not easy to access, and that's a kind of big issue with the scientific kind of publishing arena in general. You probably know, but maybe don't, that when it comes to publishing, the scientists that produce the work are not paid for their research. They actually pay journals to submit their research to that journal. So it's a really topsy-turvy publishing kind of situation, and it means that for a lot of it, the journals are coming out on top, and the actually your scientists don't really get much other than their work being published. So it's quite an unusual thing. I can talk for a long time about this. It's quite a topsy-turvy way of publishing. So it does mean that occasionally, well, quite often, you can get research that's stuck basically behind a paywall, which means that you would need to pay to access it. Some of the best ways around this, I would really highly recommend just emailing the paper authors. For the most part, when you look up a piece of research, you should have access, or at least the ability to find out the email or the contact details of the lead author or another author on that paper. And I have to say, of when this has happened to me and I've had to email researchers for their work, they have never, ever not sent it in a PDF format if you ask nicely. A lot of them are actually really interested in why you're looking into their research as well. So in some ways, it's a way to connect to researchers too. So never ever hesitate emailing the paper authors for a copy of their work. For the most part, they'll be delighted. Open access journals and open access articles do exist. So in order for an article to be completely free and open access, the scientists who submit it actually have to pay a small fortune to allow that to happen. So for sometimes many reasons, published works are not open access because the expense is too great. However, when they are open access, you can look up where these are and what ones are open access through the Directory of Open Access Journals and through a website that I found called Unpaywall. Okay, so moving on from our journals and our kind of scientific research, when we come upon a thing that we have found in a survey or walking on the beach, as part of the work that we're doing as monitoring and survey, how do we find out what this thing is? Never seen it before, not sure where to start. So some of the resources I've put on here are absolutely fantastic. And the thing that I find most helpful is where there's lots and lots of pictures associated with things, which allows you to kind of compare as well. So I'd always suggest if you find something on survey, whether it's using imagery or not, is to try and take a good picture, which will allow you to try and work out exactly what it is. So marlin is one of the ones I often go to for species. iNaturalist is really useful if you're trying to figure out if something's been spotted in that particular area before, and to get lots of different people's pictures of that particular thing as well, which might be useful for comparison. So all of these are really useful and come with a whole load of other resources as well, which are great if you're trying to find out what this mystery creature might be. And then, of course, we've got our guidebooks, which are invaluable. I mean, the sea search guidebooks are absolutely fantastic. Certainly the sponge and sea squirt one, and I think the seaweeds and some of the other ones are kind of the first of their kind and to actually have in situ pictures of the species. So these are really, really great. The Handbook of Marine Fauna of Northwest Europe is another fairly weighty tome, which is used in kind of it's a little bit more detailed and it lists lots and lots and lots of invertebrate species that might be quite hard to ID, but it is a useful thing to have on hand if you've got something quite unusual. And it does have a way of looking through species by using a key, which helps you kind of navigate through the different families of various species that you might come across. It's a good thing to have. It is a little bit pricey, but there are secondhand copies available out there as well, so worth looking into. So moving on from kind of species level, we're thinking maybe more about classifications of habitats and things, and that really comes down to when you're looking at your overall habitat, especially when it comes to imagery. So things like using BROV or drop-down cameras, it's useful to have a kind of understanding of what habitat that might be classed as. So we talk a lot about biotopes, and the term biotope was actually introduced in 1908 by a German scientist, and it kind of basically encaptures a term that describes a method which is attempting to kind of explain the variation across ecosystems. And it explains and summarizes the environmental conditions and the species present, and especially those species that are most representative of that habitat. So the species that are kind of most likely to be there or most numerous. So there are connections between biotopes. However, the distinction between the biotopes are not linear, and it's quite difficult to divide a habitat up neatly. I mean, you can look at, for example, at any forest and find it probably quite difficult to identify whether there are particular sections of habitat within that. And the seabed is no different. So biotoping is difficult, but manageable in some cases. And certainly there are overarching biotopes that might be a kind of overarching description of something that you're looking at, for example, a marl bed. So when you're looking for resources that might help you with this, the ones on the screen are really good, especially the descriptions of the Scottish Priority Marine Features, the PMFs is excellent. You've also got the GNCC catalogue down on the right, bottom right, which is actually the catalogue of all the biotopes there, which is again really useful and does contain pictures. The other three are also worth having a wee look at if you're trying to get a wee bit more familiar with this side of classification, which can be useful when you're looking at your surveys. So just really quickly, theses I've mentioned. So unfortunately, just because of the way that theses kind of work and how students often will move on once they've completed a piece of work, a lot of theses don't go on to become peer-reviewed published papers. However, they are still peer-reviewed because they wouldn't pass as theses if they weren't. So it's actually quite useful to look at theses and see whether there's anything in them that might be useful. Because they're quite large, a lot of them go into really great detail on the topic that they're looking at. So if you are looking for a thesis or know that there's a thesis out there that you want to have a look at, checking out Ethos or the open access website is really, really useful for that, and hopefully you will get a copy of that through there. I'll quickly just go over policies and political. This is also kind of useful if you're looking for a kind of background context to a particular piece of legislation or something that impacts the particular area that you're in. So the Scottish Parliament Information Centre, SPICE, is great. They produce loads and loads of kind of summary documents of various things that goes on within policy and through the political rounds. And of course, the ScotGov website has a policy search function as well, where you can actually look into the main policies that contain a particular phrase, which is what that wee screenshot is on the right there. So if I typed in marine conservation, for example, you can find a policy that's related to that, which is really quite useful when you're building a wee background on certain things. So I'll just quickly go into resource management. So if you, for example, had a baseline survey and you knew you were going to conduct some baseline survey and monitoring, but you wanted to find out kind of what information already existed for that particular area, you might end up being faced with quite a lot of work that's already published and already out there. And I find it very difficult to keep a track record of the things that I've read and what year they are and who's done it. So what I usually do is make a very, very simple Excel spreadsheet, which basically kind of keeps a log of all the things that I've run into that might be useful. And it allows me to come back to those things as well if I have information that I want to check back on. So simply, that would involve having a code. So if it's one big spreadsheet for everything, a code's useful, which means that you can code something as, for example, Merle, or you could code something as skate or something in that way. And it means you can then kind of classify your own research bank. Having the year and the authors is obviously really important, so you can go back and potentially cite that information if you were going to write it. The title, the species, location is also really handy because you might find quite a lot of research that isn't specifically Scottish, but also is relevant because it's in Norway, for example. And then having a wee section which allows you to take notes and write down the main kind of topics that came out of that paper is really useful. So you can go back and potentially look back into that information if you need to. I also do a few little things in Excel to make my life easier, which helps me manage and search through my records if I need to. So one of the first things I do is I go to the View tab, and then I go across to freeze panes, and then I choose freeze top row, and that basically freezes the top row of your Excel spreadsheet so that when you scroll down the titles can still be seen, which I find really handy because I forget what the titles for my spreadsheet are, and I don't know what each is referring to. So it means that you can scroll down and you can still see that that A column is still named code. So that's really, really handy. The other thing that I like to do is I like to enable the feature which allows me to filter through my various columns. So what I do there is I go to the Data tab at the top of the Excel spreadsheet. I go across to Filter, and then I I actually highlight that first row. So that's important. Highlight that first row, then go to Data, then go to Filter. And that basically puts this little drop-down box next to the title, and it allows you to then choose through specific types that you've given a name to. So if I could click on that little down box next to species and habitat, it might have, for example, marl, skate, blue mussel, kelp, and I can check maybe just kelp, for example, and that'll give me all of the research or papers or anything that I've noted down, particularly on kelp, and show it all together. So that's really, really handy just as a kind of management feature. You probably already know this. I'm sure a lot of you are Excel whiz kids, so apologies if I'm preaching to the choir. Okay, quickly, resource management tools. There's quite a lot out there. They are all pretty much the same. I like to use them as well as my Excel spreadsheet because it keeps everything in one place. Once I look through my Excel spreadsheet and see I want to read this thing by whoever Smith in 2025, I can go to my library, which is in one of these research management tools, and pick that paper back up. I use Zotero. It's fine. It's pretty much as you see on the screen there. It has a section which allows you to see all your titles. You can also filter through things and search through things. Both Zotero and Mendeley are free to a point, which is great. So you can store quite a lot of information on those and have your papers and resources there. I actually haven't used EndNote, so I'm not really sure whether it's free or what its usability is. But all are good and useful when you've got quite a lot of information you're trying to get through. So as I promised, this wasn't going to be a long one. So that is pretty much me. I would love to hear whether any of you guys have any kind of anything that you use that hasn't really been mentioned and you'd like to share with other people. So please just jump straight in if you've got anything that you'd like to add to what you've heard this evening. I hope everyone's still there.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Texa. We have a section on resources on our website, and there's no resources on it. I think it's a bit odd, but anyway, I think it was a design feature. But what are we allowed to publish there? Can we publish papers, or put papers on there, or do we need permissions for certain things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you'll definitely be allowed to put links to papers. So whether you're actually allowed to have a PDF, for example, of something that's published, I would probably say possibly not. There's usually quite a lot of sharing agreements and laws associated with actually publicizing and having a copy of that free to hand. It really would depend on what it was. Certainly links to things are fine. So if you say here's our resources and here's a link to this paper from this journal or this report, you're more than able to do that. But having the physical copy, if it's not owned by you, is probably I wouldn't do that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Good question, though. That's a good point. Yeah, this is why reaching out to the journal author is a good idea to get a copy of the PDF, because usually they're kind of happy to allow you to have that copy. The journals get sniffy about sharing agreements, which is why, you know, a lot of research is paid for and submitted to them. So if you kind of contact them, the author, that circumnavigates that situation a little bit. Anyone else got anything that they use or anything that really helps in this situation? No, I can't see any of you now, so I'm hopefully that was of use to you guys. I have recorded it, so anything that you want to watch back or get a link to, do reach out. I can actually give you the actual links to some of the things that I've put into that presentation. If you just give me a wee email, that's not a problem at all. Yeah, what I'll do, I'll just stop the recording perhaps.